we're going to be talking about work and work in the sense that, I'm talking more about kind of the work that goes unnoticed, right? And this is something that you we all notice. I mean, it's a phenomenon that is discussed in our culture, right? Like people talk about it, and work that goes unnoticed, right? Like you put in the work, and you do the hard work, and sometimes it just doesn't, like people don't appreciate the work that you do, right? And so, and this is something that, thankfully, because I think there are a lot of issues in a society that are not always talked about, but at least this is recognized. And I wanted to talk about this because, at least it's recognized. And so, but I still feel like it's like we still haven't learned our lesson. We like it's like we don't care, or I don't know. So I'm gonna discuss this idea of, like, why is it that in our society we have, let's say you work at a job, right? And I'll give this example because, um, this could apply to other things, but we'll start with this. You work at a job, and let's say you work really hard, right? And then, you work super hard, right? You work as hard as possible. And on the first day, and then the second day, and then the third day. And then let's say it gets a little slower, and then the person, maybe the manager, right? The person in charge, the boss, and then they notice the slowdown a little bit, and then they think that you're not working as hard, even though, it's not really your fault. And then all of the other hard work that you did before, it wasn't appreciated, right? So, that's an example of where the work goes unnoticed. Or sometimes, you might work hard. Like, let's say another scenario would be, sort of unusual circumstances. Like, let's say you worked really hard, right, at a job, and let's say you did everything, and then you had some unusual circumstance, like maybe more people than usual, or maybe, other workers perhaps were slacking off, and then you were kind of covering for them, right? You were doing more work, but then the manager might not notice that, and then they might blame you. They might think, oh well, you didn't do as much, and it's a lot of it is just optics. But it's almost like in life, how often work goes unnoticed, right? But probably the biggest one is the idea of expectation, right? And this is something that happens in the workplace, but also in a household, right? So you might have, a father, and let's say there's a daughter, and the daughter is very high achieving, right? And always gets straight A's, but then another daughter, let's say, it doesn't do as well, but then, let's say the father doesn't really care that much, and so it's almost like the work goes unnoticed. It's not appreciated, right? So we see this in siblings. We see this in scenarios where you have, where, and as a society, we seem to understand it, right? Like, I see it articulated all the time, right? Like you have a worker, let's go back to the worker, and it's the same kind of thing, right? If a worker does, if they're used to doing a lot of work, going above and beyond, and then if they go back to doing, and then someone else comes along and they do less, but then it's like your work goes unnoticed. It almost feels like it doesn't matter, or like people don't. And then people, the solution that a lot of people come up with is that, well, I might as well not work as hard, because if they do, they'll give you more work. And then when they give you more work, they get disappointed at you not working as hard. Or so let me explain that again. So this is kind of the other scenario that I was thinking, which is, let's say you do a certain amount of work, and there might be a name for this actually, and then they give you, so the better you are, the more work they give you, and then if you fail, it makes you look like a failure, but you were actually doing a lot more work than normal, if that makes sense. So in a way, you weren't actually failing, you were doing really good. But in the eyes of someone who, but in the eyes of an untrained eye, or somebody who just doesn't pay attention, or perhaps doesn't realize, like for some reason psychologically we associate that with failure. We don't realize that success sometimes looks like failure. We just don't realize that as humans. For some reason, if somebody walks in and has a neat looking area, even though they did less work, that looks better than somebody who did 10 times as much work, but it looks messy. Does that make sense? Isn't that crazy how that is? And part of it is just psychology. But but usually the person that does the work can readily see that, right? Like if you've done the work, if you did 10 times more work, even though it looks shabby, even though it looks like it wasn't fully completed, that's still more work, and it might even be more valuable, but it still doesn't look as valuable as someone else who always does less work. And maybe the supervisor or the leaders, they might not, they don't. It's kind of relative. Like it's almost like their standard changes depending on who they're, and the higher your standard, the higher your, the higher your output, the higher expectations, the higher the expectations become. And of course, it's not fair, right? It's readily apparent to someone who is a high achiever. You will notice this phenomenon. You will notice this idea that you do more, and then one little problem, and then it kind of ruins everything. But why? Do you know what I mean? Even though you did everything else right, if that makes sense, right? And sometimes, and then of course, what's, it would be great, I guess, if you could talk about it, but because, and you might say, well, why not just call it out, right? Why not just tell people what's happening, right? Because you might say, and it is something that people talk about, but a lot of times the solution seems to be, well, just don't ever overachieve, don't ever overachieve in school, don't ever overachieve, because it just goes unnoticed, or people, and then, that's one way of looking at it. But if I think the reason why you can't always talk, because sometimes people say, well, why can't you just tell your parent, like, hey, you know what, my little sister, why can't a big sister who is an overachiever talk about, all the extra effort that she does? Like, why can't she just tell the parent, right? Why can't, and in a sibling scenario like that, and then the issue becomes, I think the reason why is because there's a power issue involved. It's more than just the work, because work doesn't exist kind of on its own. It exists within the context of power and perceptions of other people. So, you're not in charge, and in certain scenarios, you don't want to rock the boat, right? You don't want to perhaps offend or you don't want to, because if you become argumentative, that could all of a sudden puts you into a negative light, right? It puts you into and so now they're looking at you like maybe, like somehow it changes the tone, and it also questions kind of the authority perhaps, or questioning their, you're suddenly questioning their judgment, right? Even though you might be right, even if you explain it, a lot of times, I don't know how to explain it. Of course, the fear is that they have the power to just say no, or to perhaps not understand, or to not care, or like just so many issues, right? And so whenever you tell someone, right, like let's say you are a worker or whatever it is, even in a friendship, right? There's always, like, how often do you feel like, oh man, I want to say something, but you can't, because if you do, it messes up with the dynamics of the power, and you don't know how the other person will react, and if they might not, they might not understand what you're saying, which is crazy. Like, it's crazy to think, because people are constantly, at the end of the day, I guess you could say it's just not fair, right? Like, it's not like different, what people care about and what people want. Again, the work goes unnoticed, right? In certain scenarios. And I mean, right now I'm just kind of talking it out. I don't, I'm going to see if I can come up with solutions, but like, I'm saying this, I think me just talking about this is enough to try to talk about it. And I think too often, people they seem to be aware of this phenomenon, but why isn't it, common knowledge? And even if it is common knowledge, like, oftentimes, I guess there's another overarching theme, which is that, in life, you can't always know exactly what is happening. You just can't always know what's going on. And so in a way, maybe that's another reason why, so not only is there an issue of power, and how, people are afraid that, because you're afraid to speak up, right? Because if you do, you might upset the person in charge, or the person in charge just might not care. They might not care about it at all. And they might just, if anything, they might not, it might not matter. And so if you saying it kind of puts you in a bad light, and then also everyone else now knows what you're thinking, and then all of a sudden, do you know what I mean? Like, there's so many elements happening that it's not just a simple matter of just explaining something, right? And like, because at the end of the day, if you are in a position where you are working for someone else, at the end of the day, you're not in charge, right? You're not the leader. At the end of the day, even though you might be smarter, or you might be able to do it, or you might be, in many scenarios, like, there are just certain, I guess certain, like, stratas, there's stratum. There are certain levels that you can't overcome, at least not at that moment, right? And so that all has an effect on what's happening. So that affects what you can say, what you can do. It doesn't even matter. Like, maybe you are right, but no one is going to listen or care, because no matter what, you're kind of stuck in that position. So you could be, so the person, the leader, I guess, the person in charge might not be the smartest person. And the person, kind of the lowest person, might be the most intelligent. And then the people in the middle might all be, maybe in the middle, right? But the thing is, you bring up something, right? Nobody one of two things: either they understand but don't care, or people might just not understand at all what you're saying. They might not get it, or there might be too many factors. And the thing is, this is another thing too, is that, in life, and this is something, it might be fortunate or unfortunate, but a lot of times it's just complicated. It's not, you can never really know exactly why something happens. I wish that it was a simple matter of, that you could just look at a scenario and always know exactly how it happened. But it's been my experience that a lot of things are kind of, they're not necessarily black or white. And there's a lot of gray, and not just gray, but sometimes like completely muddled, to the point where it's almost impossible to tell exactly. And even if it is, even if there is one interpretation, there's so many different scenarios. There's so many things where, like, two things can be true at the same time, especially when it comes to work, or when it comes to like a scenario, or, let's say there is something that happens, right? Just like I said, I mean, let's give the example of, you're working on a project at work, But imagine if you're at a job, you're working at a project, and like one employee has one interpretation of what happened, and then you ask this employee what happened, they'll tell you something else, and then this employee will tell you something else. They each have a different perspective. They all and they all represent reality to some extent. Maybe some of them, maybe they're all telling some truth, maybe they're not telling. Like there's just so many factors. And then even if they are all, let's just assume that they're all earnest and saying their interpretation, right? It might still not match. It might still be different. And then there's the other interpretation, the other point of view, which is that there are things that happen that none of these three might have paid attention to. And that's the thing. Like in life, there's so many things happening at the same time. There could have been like a cockroach that was, scurrying around in this corner, right? But maybe none of them ever noticed, right? Now, does that mean that it never happened? No, it doesn't. But the point is they didn't notice, right? But that's reality. That's something that happened. And so, what I'm trying to say here is that in these scenarios where you have where everything has multiple perspectives. Everything has almost an infinite number of perspectives depending on where you are, and most people can only give you a limited sliver of reality, unfortunately. And so I wish that there was and then there are some scenarios where it's entirely possible where two people can kind of be right at the same time, or sometimes by coincidence, two problems can come up and they're both kind of, they're both correct. Like they're both problems, legitimate problems. And so how do you solve it? And there's not really an easy way to solve it because this person is right and this person is right too. So but maybe obviously I would hope that a wise person would be able to come up with that, right? Imagine if there was a wise leader or boss who was able to think about that. But then there are some bosses who might not have that way of thinking and might be more like, someone has to be right, someone has to be wrong. So it's, like I said, and either way, of course, if these people are not leaders, I don't know if they are or not, but if they're not leaders, then they're not going to really know, right? They're not going to really be able to, you'll never be able to really say, and everyone is different. That's what I'm saying. And so in life, you might not be able to solve the problem. It might not be fair, right? And depending on what you are, right? Whether it's a daughter, father, or mother, son, or whatever relation, or a boss and a worker, right? Like there are certain sort of rigid layers that are embedded, and sometimes you can't really change it. Like you can't, at least not at that moment. And so when you understand that, it basically means that you're kind of at the mercy of whoever is in charge of you. And sometimes they might be, fair in some ways, and maybe sometimes they might not understand, or they might overlook, or there's just so many different so many different scenarios, right? And the reason why I'm talking about this is because, when it comes to studying, when it comes to learning, why am I talking about this in this channel, I guess? And I think it's because it's something that that happens whether you're doing work or whether you are, trying to get a career, or you're in school, or you're in college. It's the same thing, right? A college professor, sometimes they may not appreciate the work that you do. These are things that kind of apply to any scenario where people are doing things and it sometimes doesn't go noticed. And, if you're in college and you're studying, right, imagine if you might, somebody, this is a good example where, again, there might be a misunderstanding of who how difficult something is, or how to judge something. Everyone has a different interpretation of what they think makes better work. And so when you're trying to compare, which inevitably that ends up happening in universities, right, where they're so competitive, it's like, how do you choose which, what to emphasize and what to give priority to at any one time? And so, and everyone is going to have a different philosophy in that regard. And I guess what I'm saying is that in those cases, thankfully, I think the solution to this is that instead of worrying so much about how people might, whether someone is going to like you or not, is your professor going to like you or not, is, whatever, is your boss going to like you or not, just realize that one of the kind of blessings of the universe is that, basically randomness, and that is your friend, because at the end of the day, you're going to meet people who like you and people who understand you and will listen to you. And then some people just won't. And so it's really random, And so what I'm saying is you might lose hope in some cases, but I think my advice and my what I would say is that try to find, because you, just like there are people who might not understand you, hopefully you'll be able to get into a scenario where you can find people who are going to be able to appreciate you. And so your job is kind of to find when you have the ability to, if you can, try to find people who can appreciate you and accept you. And even in those cases, you might not be able to find the fullness of, people understanding you, but at least, I guess what I'm saying is the hope, the glimmer of hope that I'm giving is that you will find companies and leaders that will hopefully be able to value what you have to offer. And this is why I'm saying, this is really a message about work that goes unnoticed. And in my case, I think that if you have work, I believe, and this is just, I guess, my view, is that I do think you should do your best work. Don't, even though in our society, I think the common thinking is, well, because of this, just don't bother working too hard because, there are some people who won't appreciate it. But in my view, I think that there are people, I would counter that and say that I don't know that I would agree to that or that I would give that advice, because there are people who will appreciate it. And if you make a habit of not doing your best work, then you might not ever reach your full potential. And somebody who actually does appreciate what you do might not ever realize who you truly are. And you might actually become a person of lower standard, lower than what you actually are. And so don't short sell yourself, if that's the right word to use. I guess what I'm saying is put your best effort forward. Put a good, acceptable amount of effort, even if it goes unnoticed. And the reason why is do it for yourself, because someday someone can see you and will realize what you're doing. And likewise, if you ever move to a different company, or if you go to a different college, or you go to a different, eventually someone hopefully will find out who you are, but you won't be able to reach those highest levels if you don't practice, if you do not if you somehow choose to do less than if you make a habit of not putting your best effort, you will become that person. And that's not, obviously you want to be someone, I believe. I mean, if you're studying so that you can do great things, and so that your standards can be high, and you can learn to to be who you are meant to be, as best as you can. And so this is this is just a topic that I think young people, they seem to understand. Like, even young people understand this, right? So, because I see that all the time. I see it in videos. I see people all the time talking about this issue. But I feel like as a society, like, why is it not more openly talked about? You know what I mean? And it's so relevant. And a lot of times, I think people try to shut it down too. They kind of try to, they might, it's almost like people are afraid to say it. And everyone has a different story, I guess, for every scenario, like I said. But even so, like, if, I wish that, obviously, but like I said, I think I already gave the answer to that question, which is, why don't we just always speak up, right? Why not, why doesn't the worker always just speak up and say, hey, wait a minute, this person did this, but I did this. And it's like, and I think the reason why is because of the power. Because when you are, if you have a college professor, or you have a boss, or you have, whatever, you're always making a judgment, or a parent, right? You're always making a judgment call whether you should say something, and or if you say something, they might react, they might take it out on you. They might somehow think that you're trying to or they might not understand what you're saying, and in that case, it might make you look bad. It makes all of a sudden. I mean, if somebody doesn't understand why it's happening, just because you understand it doesn't mean they understand it. And if they don't understand it, then it'll just look like you are kind of being rude or whatever. And so all of a sudden, it creates this scenario where, so as a person, at least this is how I approach it anyway. I always think, before I do something, I think, like, what's going to happen if it's like I'm playing chess. So, in every social scenario, and I don't know you guys tell me if you guys do this, but in pretty much every social scenario, I'm not like an animal where I just kind of act out. I don't know if there's humans out there that are like that, but for me, I'm playing chess with every single scenario that I encounter. And I'm making a judgment call. Is it better for me to, should I speak up, or should I tell them the good work that I did, or should I, because I don't know if they'll appreciate it, or if, do you know what I mean? And so in some cases, if it's not appreciated, then, you're kind of, it puts you in a weird scenario where, and when you're in a place where, like a workplace or a college or anywhere where there's a level of authority, all of a sudden, I don't know, maybe I'm overthinking it, but I sometimes, at least I'm just describing my scenario and what's happened to me, over the years. And so, but, and maybe my approach is wrong. Maybe I should be more honest, maybe, I don't know. But see, sometimes I could see how that might backfire if you might be new and the other person might think you're trying to cause trouble, like there's just too many scenarios that just run through my head. And I'm curious if you all experience that. And of course, so a lot of times, and then there's the other case where sometimes you don't even get a chance to talk about it anyway, right? Like, you'll do something, and let's say the professor, or, it looks like you didn't do the work properly, but you did, let's say, or whatever it is. And let's say the professor walks in, or the boss walks in, and then they quickly see, and then they make a judgment, and then they walk away. And it's like, that's it. You don't have time to explain it. And that could also be the case as well. So it might not even be a case of, there might not even be a choice. Do you know what I mean? There might not be an opportunity to even correct it, or it might not even be a big deal too. A lot of the work that happens are temporary, right? Like, let's be honest, most of the stuff that happens in school or at work are really not that important. And I know that sounds weird to say, but like, let's just be honest. Most of the time, if you're working at a retail place, or you're working, wherever you're working, or you're doing a school assignment, I mean, it's not like at the end of the day, the stuff you do is not, it's like, it's important to, in a sense that you're getting paid or you're getting a good grade, right? If you're doing a schoolwork, if you're going college work, you're getting a degree, so it's important in that sense. But really, the situations themselves are never that important, and because they're never that important in the sense that they don't, like, the value is had in the amount of money that you make or whatever, or the grade that you get, but the value itself is not that big of a deal. Like, most of us are not Einstein and discovering some new invention, right? We're not Nikola Tesla. We're not changing the world. Most of us are not doing that kind of work, right? And most of us are not doing that kind of research. And so it's not like this huge deal. It's not it's not like, and so what that means is that we're not Marie Curie kind of Curie or whatever, doing some scientific discovery. Like, what we are is, a lot of times it's weird because a lot of the work and the study work that we do, it's important, but it's not like this earth-shattering thing. It's not this big, it's not big enough, but to be that important. And so whenever there's an issue that comes up, most people just dismiss it. Most people don't even remember like what happens, right? Like let's say there's something that happens at work a week ago, or something that happened in class like last semester. Nobody cares anymore. Right? Like, if you bring it up, imagine if you were to walk up to a professor and be like, hey, like 2 semesters ago, this happened. And the professor's going to be like, okay. Like, they don't even remember probably. And even though, right? And why don't they remember? Because it's not important. It was just a little assignment. But of course, there were still, kind of emotions riding on it. There was still work. There was still perhaps misunderstandings that happened, right? That would make it so that work was unnoticed, right? Just like we just talked about. So then, and so when you think about it, in that case, it just makes it so that in life, it's not even that important. A lot of the things that we do is not that important, and so it ends up, that's one of the reasons why they don't. One of the reasons why when you bring something up, if you bring up an issue or whatever, a lot of people will just dismiss it because they'll think, well, is it really that important? And then it's like, well, yeah, it's something that happened before, and they're like, just forget about it. And so we do that too, right? And so we spend our lives kind of, whenever an issue happens, almost all the time, we have to ignore it. And so I think that's kind of the, that's kind of the modus operandi, right? The way that we do things is that we generally speaking, that's probably the wisest thing to say, right? Like, if somebody were to come up to me and talk about this very issue with me, I would say, well, you know what? That it's just kind of how it is. Like, we all kind of, and actually the more intelligent you are, the more you'll notice kind of these unfairness. But then I also think that you need to have a certain, or at least I try to have a certain level of humility, because sometimes I could be wrong, right? And maybe that's the other real reason why you can't just divide life into fair and unfair, because the reality is it's not always fair, but also, it might not be fair for different reasons. Like I might not have the full picture. So even though something might seem like, something might seem like it's one way, I might be wrong actually, and you might not realize that. Just like the scenario that I gave with, where I talked about the cockroach on the other side of the spaceship, right? Or whatever. the satellite Earth thing. All right, like nobody noticed. Sometimes maybe something happened that I didn't notice, and so it's not possible for us to even fully understand sometimes exactly what happened. In the case of work, at least, right now there are some things where it's a little more apparent, I guess, to tell what happened, but especially when it comes to work, right? Because work isn't really, work is like a complex thing. It's something that you do, but it's not really like, if you do something, or if you don't do something, there's not really kind of the same level of, it's not usually a big deal, right? It's not usually a big moral dilemma, right? If you choose to do one thing versus another, right? If you choose to, walk one way or do something else, that's not really tied to moral, right? To any issues like that. So that's another reason why it doesn't matter. But it's still, as I'm bringing up right now, it's still an issue because it's still something that represents a difference in life, and also represents an opportunity for things to be for different scenarios to happen, where you might feel like, oh man, I should have gotten more credit for doing this, or and so you feel like you should have gotten more credit for something. But at the end of the day, I guess what I'm trying to say is that sometimes it's not important, and sometimes and at the end of the day, the things that we're doing are not important enough for people to care. And at the end of the day, your professor and your boss, they have a life too, and they don't actually care that much either. They're kind of like, well, that's great, but and so everyone kind of gets paid the same anyway, just for showing up. And so, it's kind of how, so I guess it all kind of boils down to, like, in life, I guess you could also argue that, well, does anything really, matter in the universe? And I guess you could, in some ways, say, like, that maybe it doesn't, but, that, so, I mean, if you want to take it that far, I guess you could, but yeah, but I guess you might, as I was saying to myself, like, well, like, so what, so if a lot of times these scenarios, they don't matter enough, then, why should we talk about it? And I think, and we do seem to, like I said, we do seem to recognize the phenomenon, because I see people talking about it, but nothing ever gets done. Usually most people talk about it, but then they say, oh, just don't work hard. And I guess what I would say is that, we might not always understand what's happening. And the other thing is that you should work hard. That's my opinion. I think and I know that's, obviously that's going to be a judgment call depending on what, see, this is where you need to, decide depending on what your school situation and job situation is. But generally speaking, I think you should do the best work for yourself. Not for anybody else, but for yourself, because do at least a competent job. Do at least what you're supposed to do. How about that? And, if you want to go above and beyond too, but the thing is, like, build that habit, because if you don't, like, it will affect you. And also you will change. You will become into someone that doesn't do things the way you're supposed to. And you might think, well, I can make myself do it. But actually, that's not how it works, believe it or not. Like, I believe that if your mind adapts to what you do, and if you get used to slacking off, or you get used to not doing things the right way, then that's going to become your modus operandi. That's going to become your standard. And even if you want to change, you won't be able to change it, which is it's a weird thing that happens. And it's why I think this question, is worth asking. And also the answer, to which my answer would be that you should do your best work whenever you can. Because when you do something good right now, when you do it right, when you follow, the protocols and you do it, it trains your mind to do it in all other scenarios as well. It kind of, it has a way of strengthening sort of that side of your mind that makes it more likely for you to follow through on whatever complex tasks that you may have. So that's why I think you should do your best work and put your best foot forward in these instances. And then, so yeah, that's how I would answer that. And the other thing too is that people often ask, when it comes to like the fairness and how, and I think this applies in school, this applies at work, but but then the other thing too, of course, that I said, and I think this helps as well, is to not be so strict. And this is the other thing that I stressed, which is that to not take things too seriously, because like I said, it's, what you're working on, even if it's like a big satellite or whatever, like obviously it's important, but like in the grand scheme of things, sometimes you're going to have to just, your work is going to go unnoticed, like, and I feel like, even people who win awards or whatever, like, it's not really enough, I feel like a lot of times, at the end of the day, when you look at a scientist or you look at inventors, they don't, even when they do get credit, at the end of the day, the work and sacrifice that goes into doing something is always it's always greater than the glory that comes with it, to be honest with you, and almost all the time. And I would say probably every time, because really these scientists and inventors, they're putting in a lot of work that just goes unnoticed and goes, and even when it does get noticed, it's still not enough. There's just so much sacrifice, and there's no other way to reach excellence, right? The only way to reach excellence is to do the hard work, and that hard work is like real, like that. It's real sweat and it's real effort, and so there's just no way around it. And I think if you want to be a person that can do these things on their own, you're gonna have to make that habit, build that habit, and I believe you will be able to succeed. You will be able to you'll be able to become someone who has that ability, and you'll be able to, and hopefully, like I said before, you'll find people who are like-minded or who are able to appreciate you. And when the time comes, or maybe someday when you become the leader, hopefully you'll be able to recognize, you can be the change that you wanted, right? Maybe someday you'll be the parent, or maybe someday you'll be the boss. Maybe someday you'll be the professor, right? I know people who become professors that I used to know. You can be these things, and then you'll be the one who, right, makes the change. But also always remember, though, no matter who you are, no matter how intelligent you are, you probably don't have all of the information. And so in a way, you're always going to have to defer, and you're always going to have to, sometimes you're going to have to say, you know what, I don't know what happened, but you know what, I hope that, you kind of give your thanks to people. If you ever do get into a position of leadership and you have people that you work with, try to show some level of gratitude. But, even then, like, words sometimes can be taken as insincere, as a form of insincerity, or like, you just never know. That's the thing. Life is full of so many different, points of views and so many different sort of possibilities and combinations that, like, you just never know. You kind of, in some ways, I wish that there was a perfect way to interpret things, but I feel like it always isn't. and that sometimes there will be things that are unfair, and sometimes it's unfair for no reason. Like it might not even be anyone's fault. It could just be luck, or it could just be, it could just be like sometimes things just turn out in ways that where there's not a clear winner, and that's just kind of most of the time it is, but sometimes it isn't. And I hope that that's a wisdom that most people have, but some people don't. And so you have to deal with that too. So you're not only dealing with sort of the possibilities of life, but you're also dealing with outside forces, people that, visitors that are coming in, and you're also dealing with the people that you work with or the students that you study with. And then you're also dealing with the professors, your leaders. And so all of these scenarios creates all of these people, I guess, create a situation where everything is a little bit chaotic, and there are a lot of different scenarios that could happen that are just not predictable. And so I guess that's just how life is. And there's Leonardo da Vinci, is who that is. So with that, I will call it. And what do you all think about what what do you think about this? What are some scenarios where you felt like it wasn't unfair, or it wasn't fair for you? And yeah, I'd be interested. And this is definitely a topic that people talk about, so I can understand. But I feel like it's not usually talked about in school or work, right? Notice how it's not talked about in school or work, right? Like, have you guys noticed that? Like, it's like they talk about it in, like, there are certain topics that people talk about, like on YouTube or whatever, but they never talk about it at work, right? That's never discussed there. It's almost like they don't want, they don't discuss it at school. And yeah, it's weird how, like, these different, I don't know, there's just different topics that sometimes just don't get uttered, and so that's why I'm kind of here. It's fun, I guess, to have this platform and to be able to, like, talk about these things. So, okay, with that, I will catch you in the next one.